Modern Japan appears to be a society of effortless discipline and social harmony. In reality, this environment rose from a foundation of wreckage, forced into existence by a society capable of rebuilding from the ashes of devastation. You see the results of that history the moment you step onto a platform. The public transit network operates with mechanical precision, with trains arriving exactly on schedule. The streets are immaculate, and the infrastructure feels flawlessly engineered. Westerners often assume this order is the natural result of an ancient culture. We look at monks, tea ceremonies, and Zen philosophy, and imagine the Japanese were sitting around in the 12th century, quietly meditating their way toward a punctual railway system. But philosophy does not automatically produce industrial might. A civilization can think deeply about existence and still have disorganized mornings. The modern Japanese state was forged through a messy, violent process, rather than ancient meditation. For centuries, Japan was divided among powerful clans and warrior elites. The samurai were not walking around politely discussing mindfulness. They were the enforcers of a highly militarized society. That civil conflict only ended in the early 1600s, when the Tokugawa shogunate established a central authority. They enforced 2 centuries of political stability by deliberately cutting the island off from the rest of the world. With the borders closed, cities grew and commerce expanded. This era of peace allowed a deep culture of craftsmanship and literacy to flourish. The social habits we now associate with Japan, order, ritual, and attention to detail, were incubated during this long stretch of isolation. But history does not care how peaceful a neighborhood is. While Japan perfected its internal culture, the Western powers were industrializing. That isolation left the nation unprepared for the technology arriving offshore. In 1853, American Commodore Matthew Perry arrived with steam-powered warships. After centuries of restricted interaction, Japan faced an existential threat. It was the 19th century equivalent of someone knocking on your door with an aircraft carrier. The message was clear. Japan's leaders recognized they could either modernize to match the West or face colonization. They chose to catch up at a pace the world had never seen. The Meiji Restoration began a systematic dismantling of the feudal structure. In a single coordinated effort, the state replaced the military, education, and industry with Western models, importing foreign experts to rebuild the country from the ground up. The transformation turned a vulnerable island into an industrial power, completely changing the country's trajectory. By the early 20th century, Japan became an imperial force itself, moving aggressively toward global conflict. Imperial expansion ended in catastrophe. By 1945, Japan's cities were flattened, the economy was shattered, and the population was decimated. During the post-war occupation, the rules of society were rewritten. The military state was dismantled, land was redistributed, and a democratic system was established. From this ruin, the economy exploded. Factories became hyper-efficient, and the phrase "made in Japan" went from meaning cheap imitation to being synonymous with quality and reliability. By the 1970s, Japanese electronics and cars were globally dominant. This miracle was not driven by magic. It was the result of highly engineered industrial systems interacting with an older cultural tradition that prioritized mastery and the group over the individual. The engine behind this growth was Kaizen, the obsession with continuous incremental improvement. Instead of chasing a single massive breakthrough, the system focuses on making every process 1% better every day, ruthlessly removing waste. After decades of repetition, these tiny improvements compound into an unbeatable advantage. By mastering the boring consistency of the assembly line, Japan turned reliability into a global weapon. But this consistency requires extreme human discipline. The concept of wa, or harmony, creates a society where you are expected to suppress your personal desires to keep the group machine running without friction. This environment produces unparalleled cooperation and craftsmanship. However, it demands a level of self-sacrifice and social conformity that Western individualists often find uncomfortable. The economic miracle turned the Japanese citizen into a unit of industrial output. Corporate loyalty meant 12-hour days and fierce educational competition, leaving very little room for a life outside the office. When the economic bubble burst in the 1990s, the pressure didn't disappear, it just became stagnant. Jobs became more precarious. The intense work culture made the financial and time commitments of starting a family a risk the system couldn't hedge. The result is a modern crisis, an aging population, and one of the lowest birth rates in the world. The same discipline that built the factories has left the younger generation without the stability or the time required to raise children. A society optimized entirely for industrial efficiency eventually hits a biological wall. Optimization requires predictable inputs and rigid schedules, but families are messy and unpredictable. It turns out you cannot engineer your way out of a demographic collapse using a spreadsheet. This is why Japanese longevity isn't a mystical secret. They deal with high stress and modern health issues like any other nation. Their health comes from ordinary behaviors: walking to the station, structured meals, and routine, repeated across an entire society. Culture is not a rule written on a wall. It's what happens when millions of tiny decisions become automatic. You learn to be quiet on the train because everyone else is quiet. A behavior becomes a norm, and eventually the norm becomes invisible. The true Japanese identity is a composite of feudal tradition, forced modernization, total wartime destruction, and obsessive rebuilding. Japan's ultimate superpower is not perfection, but its historical capacity to absorb catastrophic disruption and relentlessly reinvent itself. It is the story of a society that looked at its own wreckage and decided to build something unmistakably Japanese from the pieces.